Hi, my name is Reuben. In this series of videos, I'll walk you through the sample Pool Doctors application that I developed for the introduction of Gennaro Mobile. In this particular video, I look at the grid edit pattern that is used in the job detail grid, job note grid, job photo grid, and job timesheet grid for GLs and forms which are used to maintain and view a single record. So inside our project, there inside the 10, 20, 30, and 40 folders, we've got our job detail, job note, job photo, job timesheet, and we've got our job detail grid, job note grid, job photo grid, and job timesheet grid for GL and for FD. And they're being used to maintain a single row of data from our database table inside our job detail tables, job note table, job photo table, and job timesheet table. So these four GLs and four FDs are all very similar because they're all just basically maintaining and viewing a single row of data from a database table. So I'll just quickly run the application so you can see where we're pointing at. So we get into a particular row, a particular job, and here we've got our lines, photos, notes, and timesheet. And we list our lines, and then we can either maintain an existing line, or we can add another record. In this case, I'll select product. So now we've got 3 records there, or we can delete a record as well. And if we've got a completed record, we can come along and view one of these rows rather than necessarily updating it. So it's these screens here where we're updating one row of data from the database table is what we're looking at. So from the notes and the timesheet lines as well. Okay, so all of these use, in terms of the forms, we've got basically a typical grid form, which we saw earlier with the job header grids, but labels down the left-hand side, widgets on the right, and again, within the widget, setting the justify equals right, so that between iOS and Android, we get a similar look and feel to our application. Labels on the left, widgets on the right, and making sure the widgets start and end on the same place. So that pattern's repeated in the job detail, job notes, job photos, and job timesheet forms. All got the labels on the left and the widgets on the right. So the 4 GLs, they're called from the list programs. So the job detail list of 4GL. Remember we were in a display array and we had a append, update, delete, and the view was part of the update if we didn't have edit permissions. But basically they're calling the job detail grid method of either view, delete, add, or update. So if we look at our job detail grid, we'll see that there's 4 entry points into this function. We can either come along doing an add, an update, a view, and a delete. With the 4GL function, I should point out, you also, in the code structure on the right-hand side, we can select each of those individual functions and go straight to that point in the code. So I'll probably make a lot of use of that in this video so that we can navigate through the various functions that are in all these 4GLs. So we've got our 4 entry points: add, update, view, delete, passing in the job code, passing in the key of the record, whether we're updating, viewing, or deleting it, and the partial key for when we're adding it. And once we're in these records, they tend to follow the same pattern of, we'll go through them one at a time. So the add, we default our new values, then we open the window, do our editing, and then when we're finished doing our editing, we insert it into the database. With the update, we passed in the key, we select the record, we then open the window, edit it, and then do the database update when we're finished. View, again, we passed in the key, we select the record, but instead of editing it, this time we just view it. And the delete, again, we pass in the key, select the record, and then we do a little test to see if we want to put up a little warning to say, hey, are you really sure you want to delete it? If we do want to do that test, then we'll open the window and display the record, and then get the user to do a confirm dialog, yes or no, before we actually delete the record. And then that's the last step there. If everything's okay, then we delete the record. So that's our 4 entry points into this grid 4GL: add, update, view, and delete. All of them, once they're in there, they will open a window, and once they're finished, they'll close the window. After we open the window, we may need to populate the form a little more. So in this instance, we're populating a combo box. So this little function here goes off and does a database read. We'll navigate down to it, or it doesn't even do a database read. It's just populating a combo box based on some hard-coded values. But I think in the future I intend to put that into a database table. So open, closed, and then we've add, update, view, delete. We've opened and closed the window. We've opened the window, we close it at the end. And then if we're either editing or viewing the record. So when we're editing, this variable m_mode just tells us whether we're adding or updating. So when we came in via add, we said mode was add. When we come in via update, we say mode was update. And then that gets used in the edit function to make the primary key fields active or not. So if we're adding, the primary key fields we can change so they're active. If we're updating, we can't change the primary key fields so they're not active. Now, to save or to make these codes shorter and be more consistent with the repetition, I use the preprocessor in 2 instances in these input statements. So to make sure that my after field coding is consistent, I've got this little preprocessor to say after field name. P1 is basically the field name. Test if the field name is valid. If not okay, then display an error message and do a next field P1. And then I repeat that for my 5 fields in the form. So by doing this technique, if I come along and want to add another field, it's very simple. That's all the code I have to type rather than having to type in all those 5 lines. So I use that preprocessor technique there for my after fields, and again down in my after input. So field validation there. Okay, so when we're editing, we're doing this input statement, whether adding or updating depends whether we can change the primary key fields. We've got after field validation and after input validation. I'll look at them in a little more detail in a second. The key thing to note is for each field, there'll be a field name _valid function where we put in the logic to say whether the field is valid. And we also have a field to test if the record key is valid or if the record is valid. So there we're normally checking to see that what we've put in as the primary key is good enough for when we're adding a record. And there in the record valid, that's where we test that maybe there's a relationship between 2 fields and they have to be valid or not. That's the typical thing we put in there. But we'll look at those a little bit closer, but a little bit later. But we've got our edit with our input statement. If we were viewing the record, then having done our select, we would just display the record and do a menu statement. So we just view the record and then on action cancel, allow the user to back out. But typically we'll be editing the record, and so we're coming in here through this input statement. The input statement's just got every field that we're inputting, our after fields, and then depending on which one it is, we may have some zoom window or barcode. This barcode functionality I'll look at in another video. In the cancel action, I do a little test to see if we've actually touched anything. And if we have, then I may want to put up a cancel dialog to say, hey, are you really sure you want to back out without making any changes? I see that one in the particularly important for that text editor for the notes field, we've got a text edit. So if we, what that's testing is making sure that when we come along in here and add lots of data, now you should be clicking on that done to write the data information to the database. But if you accidentally tap here, I've put in this little confirmation dialog box so you don't lose your changes. So if you really do want to cancel, you realize you're updating the wrong job, then you can click yes and cancel out. And so that's what this bit of logic in the onAction cancel is doing, saying, have I touched anything? If I have, then put up the little dialog before either continuing the input or carrying on with the cancel. When we click the done button, then we're going to do the validation again. So that basically, people always ask me why I do the validation again in the after input, and that's because I don't trust my defaults. So I want to explicitly check that everything's valid before I write it to the database, rather than assuming that if the default was correct and I haven't touched it, then the value in the field is valid. So it's just something I've done over the years. I've always checked in the after input that the fields are valid as well. And again, I was using the preprocessor technique so that I didn't have to type out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code for each field valid routine. Now the record key valid tests the primary keys valid. So basically, normally we're making sure that the primary key doesn't exist already. If we look in, if I got one inside there, yep. So I'm basically looking to see if the job detail record exists for the entered code and line, and if it does, then I'm going to return false with an error message saying record already exists. The record valid, normally used, I normally use it for testing 2 fields or more at the same time. So I tried to make my field validation based on one field and the record validation based on all of them. And I know I've got one in the timesheet program. I come down to the find the record valid. Basically, I'm testing the start and finish time. And so I check when I'm committing the record that the start is less than the finish. If it's greater, then I'm going to return false and set up an error message. So my normal rule of thumb is if a bit of database logic or business logic depends on 2 or more fields, then I won't test that in the field validation. I'll test it in the record validation. That basically just stops the user getting stuck inside a field when the value they're trying to enter in that field is correct, but it's incorrect because of the value of an incorrect value in another field. Back to my job detail grid. So we've got our edit or our view. So edit, where input statement is, view, if we're just displaying the row, and test to see if we're doing a delete warning, if the record's valid, the record key is valid, and the record default sets up the default values for when we're adding a record. So that was called inside our add. It should be, there it is there. So when we're coming into in our add, we do our record default, and that populates each field in the forward, each member of the record with the default value as determined by a function. I don't tend to use defaults on the databases because sometimes your default's a little more complex than what we put in the default attribute on the table, or even same thing with the default on the forms. I like all my defaults to be coming out of 4GL code because then you can be consistent with where it's coming from and you can handle simple and complex default rules in the same bit of 4GL code. So yeah, the record underscore default function, that's where we're populating our default value for each field, and each field on the form should have a function that sets its default. So there's code default, line default. So the line default's interesting. It's the current maximum line number plus 1. So if there's 3 lines already, then the new one will be set to 4, etc. Product default, that's probably going to be blank in this instance. Yep. And quantity default, I default the quantity to 1. And we've probably got a status default as well. Yep, we're setting the default value to be 0. So each field that's on the form, job code, job line, product, quantity, status, I'd expect to find in my code a field name underscore default function, which has that the rule for coming up with the default value for that field. So just as I've got a default function, I'll also have a valid function. So that's the bit of code that says that has the 4GL logic that says what is valid is the value entered valid. So here we're saying job code, testing that it must be entered. Job line valid, again that it's entered and it's a positive number. We don't want to have a negative job line number. Product, checking that the product code exists in the product table. That's what that's doing. So we're making sure we're entering a product code and that it's valid. And similarly for a quantity, making sure that the quantity is positive. So my rule of thumb is that each field on the form should have a underscore valid type function, which we put in the business logic to say this is the appropriate value for that field. So that you'll see that in the job note, job photo, and job timesheet grid 4GLs as well. Yep, there'll be a default value and there'll be a grid value, a default function and a valid function. So after the quantity and default functions in the 4GL, there's also at the bottom there's the 4 database functions. So the DB select selects a single row from the appropriate table and populates the record, whereas the insert inserts the record or updates the record or deletes as appropriate. So if we follow the code through from the add, it comes through, and if the edit's successful, it'll insert the record. The update comes through and does the database update. And the view record or doesn't do any database operations. It only reads the database at the beginning, and the delete operation deletes the database at the end. Okay, so that's the basically what's occurring in all these grid 4GLs. It's got those 4 entry points for adding, updating, viewing, and deleting, and it's going to open a window or select a record if appropriate, or if we're adding, do the default. Yep, so it's going to either do the default a new record, or select a record if we're updating, viewing, or deleting, and then we're going to either display it in an input for the add and update. And we've got this nice big complex input statement where we do the field validation and set default values and then set field validation. And then finally at the end, when we exit, we do our insert, update, or delete as appropriate. Okay, and so that grid pattern associated with the list grid pattern is basically how I tend to update a single row of data from a database table inside this Pool Doctors application.